Hey guys, tonight we're venturing deep into the emerald heart of Southeast Asia, where massive stone temples rise from strangling vines, where crumbling towers peek through canopies so dense that satellites once struggled to see through them, and where an entire civilization containing the world's largest pre-industrial city lay hidden in plain sight for centuries. The humid air clings to your skin as you machete your way through the underbrush, mosquitoes buzzing in your ears. Let's be honest, without modern medicine, GPS, and a good supply of insect repellent, you probably wouldn't survive a week in these jungles, let alone uncover their secrets. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The jungle breathes around you, a living entity of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. Your boots sink slightly into the damp earth as you push aside a curtain of vines, and suddenly, unexpectedly, your hand touches not rough bark, but smooth stone, carved stone, ancient stone. You freeze, heart quickening as you wipe away centuries of accumulated moss to reveal an enigmatic smile carved by hands that turned to dust half a millennium ago. This is Cambodia, and somewhere within these densely packed trees lies one of humanity's most astonishing achievements. Entire cities, some spanning areas larger than modern Manhattan, that were swallowed by the jungle so completely that for hundreds of years, the world simply forgot they existed. It seems impossible. How could something so massive, temple complexes with towers standing over 200 feet tall, intricate canal systems stretching for miles, urban centers housing up to 1 million people, just vanish? The story of Cambodia's lost cities is not just about archaeological discovery. It's about the humbling power of nature to reclaim, conceal, and preserve. The Khmer Empire that built these cities flourished from the 9th to the 15th centuries, creating what was likely the largest pre-industrial urban complex in the world. Angkor, its capital, covered nearly 400 square miles, larger than modern Los Angeles. Yet by the time European colonizers began seriously mapping Southeast Asia in the 18th and 19th centuries, these magnificent structures had already been abandoned for hundreds of years, the jungle's green fingers slowly pulling them back into the earth. You might think that something as enormous as Angkor Wat, still the largest religious monument in the world, would be impossible to miss. And yet, for centuries, these structures existed as little more than local curiosities and vague legends to the outside world. When French naturalist Henry Mauhat stumbled upon Angkor Wat in 1860 and introduced it to Western readers, many simply refused to believe that such a magnificent construction could exist in what they considered a primitive corner of the world. As the last rays of sunlight filter through the canopy, painting the ancient stones in gold, you can almost hear the whispers of the past, the chants of monks, the bustle of markets, the splash of water in vast reservoirs that once supported hundreds of thousands of people. The stones themselves seem to hold memories, smoothed by the touch of countless hands over centuries. Historians still argue whether the Khmer cities were truly lost or merely forgotten by the outside world. After all, local people never completely abandoned these sites. They knew the temples were there, continued to worship at many of them, and passed down stories about the ancient kings who built them. What was lost was not the physical structures themselves, but the knowledge of their significance, their original purpose, and the understanding of just how vast and sophisticated this civilization had been. As night falls completely, and the jungle's daytime cacophony transitions to the equally loud but entirely different symphony of nocturnal creatures, you make camp in the shadow of a crumbling gopura gateway. The stars appear as brilliant pinpricks between the leaves overhead, not so different from what the ancient Khmer astronomers would have observed from this very spot. Perhaps they too pondered their place in the universe while gazing upward, their civilization at its zenith, never imagining that one day their greatest achievements would disappear into the embrace of the forest, waiting patiently to be rediscovered. The rediscovery of these cities is not a single event, but an ongoing process that continues to this day. Modern technology has revealed that what we thought we knew about these sites as recently as a decade ago was merely scratching the surface. The jungle kept its secrets well, and even now, it reluctantly yields them one by one, leaving archaeologists to wonder, what else remains hidden in the emerald depths? You stand before a massive face carved in stone, easily 3 times your height, with eyes half closed in eternal meditation. It's one of dozens that adorn the towers of the Bayon Temple, their enigmatic smiles following you as you move through the ruins. This place, Angkor Thom, was once the heart of an empire that controlled most of mainland Southeast Asia, a metropolis whose population may have reached 1 million people at its height in the 13th century. For perspective, that's when London was home to a mere 25,000 souls. And yet, somehow, these massive stone cities slipped from global consciousness like a dream upon waking. As you run your fingers along the walls, tracing narratives of gods and kings that stretch for nearly half a mile in the longest bas-relief in the world, it's worth considering how something so monumental could be forgotten. The answer lies partly in the nature of Khmer construction. Unlike European stone cities, with their practical, continuous structures of dwellings and shops, Khmer urban centers consisted of stone temples and administrative buildings surrounded by vast neighborhoods built from wood, bamboo, and thatch, materials that disintegrate quickly in the tropical climate. When the empire began its slow decline in the 15th century, the jungle didn't politely wait for historians to document everything. Nature moved in with remarkable efficiency, sending roots through cracks, seeds sprouting in gutters, and entire trees growing from rooftops. Strangler figs, the botanical equivalent of quicksand, embraced stone towers in their lethal hugs, becoming so entwined with the structures that removing them today would cause the buildings to collapse. It's like the world's slowest demolition crew. If the demolition crew accidentally turned into excellent structural support. Hear a rustle and turn to see a troop of macaques swinging through the ruins, modern inhabitants unimpressed by your presence or the architectural marvels around them. One particularly bold monkey sits atop a carved naga, serpent, balustrade, munching on something with judgmental eyes fixed on you. These simian squatters have history of their own here. Temple monkeys have been a constant presence for centuries, their ancestors witnessing both the height of Khmer power and its eventual abandonment. Water drips somewhere nearby, a reminder of the annual monsoons that alternately flood and parch this landscape. The Khmer mastered this cycle with an elaborate system of barrays, reservoirs, and canals that irrigated rice fields capable of yielding 3 or 4 harvests annually. This agricultural productivity fueled the empire's expansion and enabled the construction of increasingly ambitious temples. Historians still argue whether climate change and water management failures contributed to Angkor's decline, as tree ring studies suggest a series of devastating droughts hit the region in the 14th and 15th centuries. As night approaches, bats emerge from their daytime roosts in abandoned towers, thousands of them creating serpentine patterns against the darkening sky. They've been the unwitting custodians of these ruins for centuries, their guano simultaneously degrading the stone and providing valuable nutrients for the encroaching jungle. If these walls could talk, they'd probably just complain about bat excrement, proving that even in archaeological wonders, some problems are universal. The stone library adjacent to the main temple stands with its roof partially collapsed, a victim of both time and treasure hunters who believed incorrectly that its empty pedestals once held valuable artifacts. Throughout the colonial period, looters and collectors carried away countless sculptures and architectural elements, dispersing pieces of Angkor to museums and private collections worldwide. One particularly brazen French expedition in the 1870s literally sawed off sections of Angkor Wat's most beautifully decorated buildings and shipped them to Paris. Because nothing says, "We appreciate your culture," quite like dismantling it and putting it in a crate. Lightning flickers in the distance as storm clouds gather, illuminating the massive towers of Angkor Wat itself across the ancient reservoir. Even after centuries of abandonment and decay, it remains breathtaking. 5 lotus-shaped towers representing the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, home of the Hindu gods, surrounded by a moat symbolizing the cosmic ocean. The precision of its construction is staggering. The entire main complex is aligned with astronomical events, and its proportions follow mathematical ratios that reveal a sophisticated understanding of both architecture and sacred geometry. You shelter from the impending storm in a gallery decorated with apsaras, celestial dancers frozen in stone, nearly 2,000 of them throughout the complex, each with slightly different features and poses. Their delicate beauty stands in stark contrast to the massive scale of the temples, reminding you that the Khmer artisans were capable of both monumental grandeur and exquisite detail. The empire may have projected power through its imposing architecture, but it expressed its soul through these intricate carvings that catalog everything from mythological epics to everyday life in the ancient kingdom. The rain begins a tropical downpour that transforms the stone causeways into streams and amplifies the jungle sounds to a roaring crescendo. You're experiencing what Europeans couldn't comprehend from written accounts alone. The living, breathing reality of Angkor, where architecture and nature have been locked in a slow-motion dance for centuries, neither fully victorious, both transformed by the encounter. Morning breaks over the temples, and you follow a narrow path deeper into the jungle. The transition happens gradually, first more undergrowth between structures, then fallen blocks half buried in loam, and finally, you're pushing through tangled vines only to stumble upon a doorway where no doorway should be. This is Ta Prohm, the poster child for jungle reclamation, where massive strangler figs and silk cotton trees have mounted a centuries-long invasion. The scene before you has inspired countless photographers and filmmakers. Yes, including those Tomb Raider movies, which weren't exactly documentaries despite being filmed on location. Enormous roots snake down walls and across courtyards like the tentacles of some patient botanical kraken. What's truly mind-boggling isn't just the size of these arboreal invaders, some with trunks wider than your car, but the realization that they represent just a few decades of growth. The jungle you're witnessing is relatively young. The trees that had consumed these temples by the time French explorers arrived in the 19th century have themselves died and been replaced multiple times. You duck through a doorway where a massive root has created an arch overhead, squeezing the stone on either side with such force that cracks spread outward like spider webs. The interior courtyard reveals what appears to be a frozen battle between architecture and nature, except this battle plays out over centuries, with roots advancing millimeters each year. A carved stone face peers out from between strangling tendrils, wearing an expression that seems to say, "Well, this is awkward." The jungle didn't just conceal these structures, it actively disassembled them. Seeds dropped by birds germinated in cracks between stones, sending roots downward and shoots upward. As they grew, these botanical wedges exerted thousands of pounds of pressure, prying apart even the most precisely fitted blocks. Water followed the pathways created by plant roots, bringing with it minerals that further degraded the stone. Termites consumed wooden supporting structures, causing sudden collapses. And throughout it all, the constant humidity encouraged the growth of lichens and mosses that slowly etched away carvings and inscriptions. You carefully step over a fallen colonnade, noticing how a tree has incorporated several carved blocks into its root system, lifting them completely off the ground. These roots don't discriminate between soil and sculpture. They simply grow around whatever they encounter, sometimes preserving carvings by encompassing them completely. It's a curious paradox. The The same forces destroying these structures have, in some cases, protected them from exposure to erosion and human interference. The botanical takeover happened with remarkable speed. Historical records indicate that within just 50 years of reduced maintenance, pathways became impassable. Within a century, wooden buildings had completely disappeared. After 2 centuries, even locals would have had difficulty recognizing certain areas as human-made rather than natural formations. The jungle is efficient that way. It doesn't waste time when there's civilization to compost. As you push deeper into the complex, you notice something odd about the tree ahead. Its massive trunk seems strangely geometric. Closer inspection reveals it's not a tree at all, but a stone tower so completely enveloped by vegetation that only its general shape remains visible. The distinction between temple and forest has blurred to the point where you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Archaeologists working here often face this challenge, determining whether an unusual mound is a natural feature, a collapsed structure, or something in between. A sudden chattering sound draws your attention upward, where a longoor monkey observes you from a canopy of leaves. These elegant primates, with their dark faces framed by white fur like natural masks, are distant descendants of those that would have inhabited these same forests when the temples were active centers of worship. Their ancestors witnessed both the height of Khmer civilization and its gradual surrender to the elements. In their genetic memory is the entire cycle of construction, abandonment, and rediscovery that you're trying to understand. Nearby, a small shrine remains active, with fresh incense and flower offerings placed before an ancient Buddha statue. While the great administrative and ceremonial functions of Angkor vanished, worship never entirely ceased. Local people maintained connections to these sacred spaces even as they were reclaimed by forest. When 19th century Europeans discovered Angkor, they were often guided by local monks who had kept alive knowledge of these sites through oral tradition and continued religious practice. The temples were lost primarily to outside awareness, not to the people who remained in their vicinity. The forest floor beneath your feet contains its own archaeological record. Excavations reveal layers that tell the story of abandonment. First, the remnants of tile roofs collapsed onto floors, then a layer of organic matter as wooden elements decayed, followed by soil accumulation, and finally, the root systems of mature trees. This natural stratigraphy allows archaeologists to reconstruct the sequence and timing of the jungle's advance with remarkable precision. You emerge from the densest part of the complex into a clearing where conservation work is underway. Archaeologists carefully catalog fallen blocks, mapping exactly where each piece belongs in the architectural puzzle. The work is painstaking, but crucial, not only for preserving these monuments, but for understanding the sophisticated construction techniques that allowed them to stand for centuries. The same precision that made these buildings magnificent made them vulnerable to systematic disassembly by natural forces that exploit even the smallest weakness. As you watch the restoration team at work, you realize they face an impossible choice with every tree they encounter. Remove it and potentially destabilize the structure it has become intertwined with, or leave it in place knowing its continued growth will cause further damage. There's no perfect solution, only compromises that balance preservation against the reality that these monuments have evolved into hybrid creations, part human achievement, part natural process. The jungle didn't just hide these cities, it transformed them into something new that tells a more complex story than either human history or natural history alone. A cool morning mist hovers above the moat surrounding Angkor Wat as you cross the stone causeway, trying to imagine how Portuguese missionaries might have felt when they first glimpsed these towers in the 16th century. Antonio de Magdalena, a Capuchin monk who visited in 1586, wrote that the temple is of such extraordinary construction that it is not possible to describe it with a pen, particularly since it is like no other building in the world. It has towers and decoration, and all the refinements which the human genius can conceive of. Despite his wonderment, de Magdalena's account gained little traction in Europe. His writings were largely forgotten, gathering dust in Portuguese archives, while the Western world remained blissfully ignorant of what might be the most impressive religious monument on Earth. It's rather like writing a viral review of a restaurant so good it should break the internet, only to have your post settings accidentally set to private. You run your hand along the smooth sandstone of a wall gallery, marveling at bas-reliefs that depict the churning of the sea of milk, a Hindu creation myth carved with such vitality that the stone figures of gods and demons seem caught in eternal motion. These weren't crude carvings, but sophisticated artistic expressions that rivaled anything produced in Renaissance Europe. Yet, when early accounts of these monuments reached Western audiences, they were often dismissed as exaggerations or simply ignored. The challenge wasn't just European arrogance, though there was plenty of that. It was a fundamental disconnect in understanding what civilization should look like. The European model of stone cities, with their grid-like streets, connected buildings, and centralized functions, bore little resemblance to the Khmer urban pattern of stone religious monuments surrounded by wooden residential areas spread across a vast, garden-like landscape. When Europeans looked for cities in Cambodia, they often couldn't see what was right in front of them because it didn't match their mental template. The morning light catches on a carved apsara, illuminating the serene smile that has watched over this gallery for 8 centuries. These celestial dancers, nearly 2,000 of them throughout Angkor Wat alone, represent the height of Khmer artistic achievement. Each one slightly different, they record the ideal of feminine beauty in the Khmer world, frozen in stone while empires rose and fell around them. You find a relatively quiet corner and sit with your back against warm stone, opening a reproduction of a 17th century map. Early European cartographers marked this region with vague notations and often fanciful illustrations. Here be dragons, quite literally. Cambodia existed at the edge of Western geographical knowledge, a place of rumors and speculation where travelers' accounts were treated with skepticism, regardless of their accuracy. A Japanese visitor from the late 16th century left more detailed descriptions, noting a country called Kurumuru Khmer, where there was a temple like a mountain. Historians still argue whether some Chinese references to towers of bronze referred to the actual appearance of the temples or their reddish hue at sunset. What's clear is that knowledge of Angkor never completely vanished from Asian consciousness, even as the site faded from its former glory. The Dutch merchant Willem Lodewijk visited Cambodia in 1598 and made tantalizing references to wonderful but completely ruined buildings of a long-vanished civilization. Had he pushed further inland to actually see Angkor, European awareness might have come centuries earlier. Instead, his ships remained near the coast, and his second-hand accounts joined the growing collection of unverified rumors about mysterious ruins in the jungle. Climbing the steep steps of the central tower, so steep they require using both hands and feet, you reflect on how these structures were designed to be challenging. The physical effort of ascension mirrors the spiritual journey toward enlightenment, each step bringing the worshipper closer to the divine realm represented by the temple's summit. This symbolic vocabulary was lost on early European visitors, who often described the buildings purely in terms of their size and decorative elements, missing the cosmological principles embedded in their very design. At the top, breathless from the climb, you look out over the vast complex spreading below you like a three-dimensional mandala. From this vantage point, you can see the perfect symmetry of the temple layout and its alignment with cardinal directions. The Khmer builders worked without modern surveying equipment, yet achieved precision that would impress any contemporary architect. The temple's measurements reveal sophisticated mathematical knowledge, with proportions based on astronomical observations and religious numerology. A flock of parakeets erupts from a nearby tree, their bright green feathers flashing against the gray stone as they circle the towers. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about early European encounters with Angkor isn't that they failed to appreciate its magnificence, but that such a magnificent achievement could fade from global awareness in the first place. It raises uncomfortable questions about historical memory and what other wonders might have been lost, not just physically, but conceptually, erased so completely we don't even know to miss them. As you descend from the tower, you notice recent archaeological work revealing evidence of modifications to the temple over centuries. Angkor Wat began as a Hindu temple dedicated to Vishnu, but was later adapted for Buddhist worship. These religious transitions are recorded in altered carvings and added symbols, revealing that the monument wasn't a static creation, but a living cultural document continuously reinterpreted by successive generations. Early European accounts often missed this complexity, presenting the temples as mysterious relics rather than evolving sacred spaces. The jungle heat presses down on you as you follow a narrow path that French naturalist Henry Mauhat might have taken in January 1860. Mosquitoes whine in your ears, and your shirt clings to your back with sweat. Mauhat didn't come to Cambodia hunting for lost cities. He was primarily a collector of insects and plants who had developed a particular fascination with beetles. Imagine spending months in this sweltering climate chasing bugs with a butterfly net, only to stumble upon one of the world's most magnificent architectural achievements. Talk about burying the lead in your expedition journal. You swat at something buzzing near your face and consider Mauhat's circumstances. A Protestant Frenchman married to a British clergyman's daughter, he had trouble securing official backing for his Southeast Asian expeditions. He financed much of his travel through the sale of specimens and relied heavily on the goodwill of missionaries and local guides. His discovery of Angkor came during his third major expedition, when he was already weakened by previous bouts of tropical illness. Spoiler alert, he wouldn't survive to see his Angkor journals published. Breaking through a clearing, you get your first glimpse of Angkor Wat much, as Mauhat would have, the massive towers rising above the tree line, reflected in the waters of the moat. His journal captures the moment. One of these temples, a rival to that of Solomon, and erected by some ancient Michelangelo, might take an honorable place beside our most beautiful buildings. It is grander than anything left to us by Greece or Rome. Strong words from a European in an age when classical antiquity was considered the pinnacle of human achievement. What made Mauhat's account different from those who had glimpsed these ruins before him was not just his lyrical descriptions, but his accompanying sketches and measurements. He spent 3 weeks documenting Angkor in detail, producing drawings that, while not as accurate as later surveys, conveyed the scale and grandeur of the site in a way written descriptions alone could not. When these illustrations were published posthumously in travel journals, and eventually his book, Travels in Siam, Cambodia, and Laos, they provided visual proof that silenced many skeptics. You pause to drink from your water bottle, the liquid warm but welcome. Mauhat didn't have this luxury. He relied on local water sources, often contaminated with parasites and bacteria. His journals detail increasing health problems throughout his expeditions, foreshadowing his eventual fate. He would die of malarial fever in Laos in November 1861, just a year after his visit to Angkor, at the age of 35. His body was buried near a stream in the jungle, the grave marked by a simple stone that would itself become lost for decades before being rediscovered and replaced with a proper monument. Continuing along the path, you notice stone lions flanking an ancient approach to the temple guardians that have watched over this route for centuries. Mauhat was careful to note that he never claimed to be the first European to see Angkor, acknowledging Portuguese accounts from centuries earlier. What he did claim, with some justification, was to be bringing these monuments to broader attention. In the province of Angkor, there are ruins of such grandeur, remains of structures which must have been raised at such an immense cost of labor, that, at the first view, one is filled with profound admiration. The publication of his journals in 1863, 2 years after his death, sparked a sensation in Europe. For Victorian audiences obsessed with exotic Oriental discoveries, Angkor represented something even more spectacular than the Egyptian pyramids or Mesopotamian ziggurats that had previously captured public imagination. Mahat's romantically tragic death only added to the allure. The doomed explorer who sacrificed his life to reveal ancient wonders became a narrative too perfect for 19th century sensibilities to resist. You reach a small shrine where local worshippers have left offerings of incense and fruit. This continuing spiritual connection to the temples is something Mahat noted with interest, observing that despite their ruined state, many structures remained sacred to local Buddhists. Unlike some later European visitors who viewed the sites purely as archaeological specimens, Mahat showed genuine curiosity about their religious significance and the lives of people living among them. Historians still argue whether Mahat deliberately exaggerated his discovery narrative for dramatic effect, or simply became swept up in the publisher's desire for a compelling story. His original journals are more measured than the sensationalized versions that appeared in popular magazines, suggesting that editors may have enhanced the lost city angle to boost sales. Victorian readers didn't want nuanced archaeological assessment. They wanted adventure stories with crumbling temples and exotic mysteries. The sunlight shifts as afternoon approaches, casting deep shadows between columns where carvings of Devada's female divinities seem to step forward from the walls. You recall a passage from Mahat's journals describing these same figures. The elegance, richness, and symmetry of most of these sculptures make me think they were executed by Grecian or Roman artists. This comparison reveals both Mahat's genuine awe and his Eurocentric frame of reference. He could only understand Khmer greatness by relating it to Western classical traditions. What Mahat couldn't have anticipated was how thoroughly his name would become linked with Angkor, overshadowing both earlier European visitors and the continuous local knowledge that had never forgotten these monuments. His writings catalyzed French archaeological interest in Cambodia, directly contributing to the colonial project that would make the country a French protectorate in 1863, the very year his book was published. The temples he admired would soon become justification for imperial control, with France positioning itself as the necessary protector of Cambodia's cultural heritage. The morning sun beats down mercilessly as you unroll a reproduction of an 1866 map created by French explorer Ernest Doudart de Legray. This was one of the first scientific surveys of Angkor, completed just a few years after Mahat's visit, and it represents a quantum leap in understanding the site's layout. Unlike Mahat's artistic impressions, this was a methodical attempt to document the monuments with military precision, using compass bearings and measured paces to create a scale drawing of the main complexes. You try to orient yourself using landmarks on the aged parchment, appreciating the challenges these early surveyors faced. Without aerial photography, satellite imagery, or even proper surveying equipment, they had to penetrate dense jungle, cross waterways, and deal with the disorienting repetition of similar structures spread across miles. It was like trying to map a city by crawling through it on your hands and knees with a blindfold that you could only occasionally peek under. The fact that they produced anything remotely accurate is astonishing. Wiping sweat from your brow, you follow a path that cuts through what appears to be unexceptional forest. According to the map in your hands, you're actually walking through what was once a densely populated urban area. The disconnect between what you see and what once existed here highlights the fundamental challenge of mapping Angkor. Much of the city was invisible even when you were standing directly in it. The Khmer built their sacred and administrative buildings from stone, but ordinary people lived in wooden structures raised on stilts that left minimal archaeological traces. When the French began serious mapping efforts in the late 19th century, they focused on the stone monuments while largely missing the residential areas that surrounded them. It would take another century and the development of remote sensing technologies to reveal the true extent of Greater Angkor. A flash of color catches your eye, a small survey marker left by a modern archaeological team. Today's mapping efforts combine traditional fieldwork with cutting-edge technology, but the pioneers of Angkor cartography had only their wits, simple tools, and extraordinary perseverance. Louis de Laporte, who accompanied the Mekong Exploration Commission in the 1860s, produced detailed architectural drawings that remain valuable references for restoration work. His artistic background allowed him to capture details that more technically minded surveyors missed. You pause at a small shrine where an elderly local woman arranges flowers before a Buddha statue. This continuing spiritual connection to these spaces raises an uncomfortable point about early mapping efforts. They often treated living religious sites as dead archaeological specimens. The French mappers typically portrayed Angkor as abandoned ruins, rather than acknowledging its ongoing significance to Cambodian Buddhists. The maps created a fiction of emptiness that helped justify colonial control. You can't displace people who don't exist on your maps. Continuing along an ancient causeway, you consult another map, this one from the École Française d'Extrême-Orient's systematic surveys, begun in 1900. The difference in detail is striking. Under the direction of archaeologists like Jean Kamel and Henry Parmenter, teams cut sight lines through jungle, established permanent reference points, and documented even minor structures. Their approach was comprehensive but destructive, often prioritizing visibility of monuments over preservation of the ecosystem that had protected them for centuries. You reach a point where several ancient roads converge, part of the grid system that organized the imperial capital. The most ambitious mapping project of the early 20th century was the complete survey of Angkor undertaken by Victor Golobu, who combined ground-level documentation with the first aerial photography of the site. Flying in primitive biplanes over the jungle in the 1930s, Galaubu captured images that revealed previously undetected patterns, ancient reservoirs, canal systems, and road networks that had been invisible from the ground. Historians still argue whether these early French efforts were genuine scientific inquiry or elaborate justification for colonial control. The answer is probably both. The same meticulous documentation that advanced archaeological understanding also cataloged Cambodia's cultural treasures as effectively as if they were preparing an inventory for appropriation. Knowledge and power were inseparable aspects of the colonial project. As you cross a small stream on stepping stones worn smooth by centuries of feet, you reflect on how mapping is never a neutral activity. Each map of Angkor reveals as much about its creator's priorities as about the physical landscape. Early French maps emphasized monuments while ignoring living communities. Modern archaeological maps highlight features invisible to human eyes, detected through ground-penetrating radar and infrared sensors. Every map tells a story, but never the complete story. The afternoon light grows golden as you reach a lesser-known temple complex, one of dozens that early mappers initially missed or documented only superficially. Even after decades of intensive survey work, new structures continue to be identified. The complete map of Angkor remains an elusive goal, with each generation of researchers adding layers of understanding while acknowledging how much remains unknown. Looking down at your GPS device with its blinking blue dot precisely positioning you on a satellite image, you appreciate the technological journey that has transformed how we understand these spaces. The French surveyors, who spent months cutting lines of sight through dense vegetation, measuring angles with theodolites, and meticulously recording their observations by hand, would be astounded by the precision available at our fingertips. Yet their foundational work made modern mapping possible, creating the first comprehensive framework for understanding Angkor's sprawling complexity. The sun hasn't yet risen as you set out on a narrow dirt path leading away from the main temple complexes. Your destination lies beyond the familiar tourist circuit, one of dozens of satellite temples that once formed part of Greater Angkor, but remain less thoroughly explored and restored. While millions photograph Angkor Wat's famous silhouette each year, these peripheral sites offer glimpses into aspects of Khmer civilization that the grand monuments often overshadow. Dawn breaks as you reach a small temple nearly consumed by vegetation. Roots wrap around doorways like tentacles, and moss carpet stairs that haven't felt human footsteps in weeks. This is Prasat Prey, one of the many forest temples that formed nodes in the vast urban network of Angkor. Such structures weren't isolated monuments, but components in a sophisticated system, administrative centers, rest houses, hospitals, and local shrines that served communities spread across the landscape. You duck through a low doorway, disturbing a small bat that flutters deeper into the darkness. The inner chamber is simple compared to Angkor Wat's elaborate galleries. A single room with an altar that once held a divine image, now long removed. The walls bear faint traces of what might have been painted decoration, protected from the elements just enough to suggest the vibrant colors that would have adorned all Khmer temples before centuries of monsoon rains washed them away. The discovery that Angkor wasn't just a collection of temples, but an integrated urban system ranks among archaeology's most significant revelations. French archaeologist Bernard-Philippe Grosselier first proposed in the 1950s the revolutionary concept of hydraulic city, suggesting that Angkor's true genius lay not just in its monuments, but in its sophisticated water management systems that sustained a vast urban population. Looking beyond the stone gates meant understanding that the temples were just the visible skeleton of a much larger organic entity. You make your way carefully through underbrush to what appears to be a raised earthen berm, subtle, but unmistakably human-made once you know what to look for. This is part of an ancient canal, one component of the vast hydrological system that managed monsoon waters across hundreds of square miles. A lizard scurries across the path, disappearing into the undergrowth with a rustle. Standing here, it's easier to grasp why these engineering works remained invisible for so long. Their landforms, rather than buildings, blending almost seamlessly into the natural topography once vegetation reclaimed them. Colonial-era archaeologists focused almost exclusively on the monumental architecture, while largely ignoring these subtler elements of Khmer engineering. The canals, embankments, reservoirs, and field systems that actually sustained the civilization were quite literally beneath notice. It would take aerial photography and eventually satellite imagery to reveal their extent and importance. Even today, archaeological teams continue to discover new components of this vast system, hidden beneath jungle growth and rice paddies. Beyond the well-documented center of Angkor lie dozens of provincial temples that once formed administrative centers in their own right. You consult your map and change direction, heading toward a site marked as Banti Esre, Citadel of Women, named for the intricate carvings believed too delicate to have been executed by male hands. A bit of archaeological sexism that persisted far too long. Though smaller than Angkor's central temples, this pink sandstone jewel demonstrates how far the Khmer aesthetic influence extended. Path narrows as you enter denser forest. Occasionally, you pass stone boundary markers or fragments of laterite wall, reminders that this was once a carefully delineated sacred landscape, where every hill, stream, and clearing held significance. One of archaeology's greatest challenges at Angkor has been reconstructing this cultural geography, understanding how ancient Khmer people perceived and organized their environment according to religious and political principles that left few written records. A sudden opening in the canopy reveals Banti Esre's delicate towers, their warm pink stone glowing in the morning light. This temple, dedicated in 967 CE, predates Angkor Wat by more than a century and represents a different architectural tradition within the Khmer repertoire. Its relatively small scale permitted a level of decorative detail impossible on larger monuments, every available surface covered with intricate carvings depicting celestial beings, mythological scenes, and floral motifs executed with extraordinary precision. You trace a carved panel depicting a scene from the Ramayana epic, where the demon king Ravana shakes Mount Kailasa, while the god Shiva casually steadies it with his toe. The level of three-dimensionality achieved in this relatively shallow relief demonstrates the Khmer sculptor's mastery. It's no wonder this site became one of André Malrox's targets when the French novelist-turned-adventurer decided to liberate some sculptures in 1923, an act of theft that resulted in his arrest and helped prompt more formal protection of Cambodia's antiquities. Historians still argue whether Banteay Esray's outlying location indicates it was built as a retreat for the elite or served as an important regional center in its own right. What's clear is that it wasn't an isolated monument, but part of a network that stretched across what archaeologists now call the Greater Angkor region, an area covering nearly 3,000 square kilometers, 1,158 square miles, that constituted the urban core of the Khmer Empire. Heat intensifies as you continue your exploration beyond the temple proper, following what might have been an ancient roadway, now reduced to little more than a slightly elevated path through secondary forest. Colonial-era maps labeled much of this area as forested, or simply left it blank, missing the significance of subtle topographical features that recent research has identified as neighborhoods, workshops, and agricultural plots. You pause where archaeologists have excavated what appears to be the foundation of a wooden structure, post holes, arranged in a rectangular pattern that once supported a building on stilts. Unlike the stone temples that survived centuries of tropical weathering, these ordinary dwellings left only the faintest archaeological signatures. Yet, they housed the majority of Angkor's population, the farmers, craftspeople, and servants whose labor made monumental construction possible. Recent excavations have revealed surprising sophistication in these ephemeral structures. Some had glazed tile roofs, plastered walls, and even rudimentary plumbing systems that connected to larger urban water networks. Far from being simple huts, many were substantial multi-story dwellings that would have compared favorably with contemporary housing in medieval European cities. Their disappearance created the false impression of temples standing in empty jungle, rather than the densely populated urban landscape that existed during Angkor's heyday. As afternoon approaches, you make a final stop at what appears to be an ancient reservoir, now a marsh filled with lotus plants and water birds. Local villagers fish here, continuing practices that have sustained communities in this region for millennia. The continuity of rural life stands in stark contrast to the disruption of urban traditions following Angkor's decline. While the great administrative centers were abandoned, agricultural communities adapted and persisted, maintaining elements of knowledge and practice that connect modern Cambodia to its ancient past. This living connection represents the final and perhaps most significant aspect of what lies beyond the stone gates. Not just more ruins and archaeological features, but a cultural legacy that survives in contemporary Cambodian life. From religious practices to agricultural techniques, aspects of the ancient Khmer world continue to influence modern communities, demonstrating that while the cities may have been lost to Western awareness, they were never entirely forgotten by those who lived among their remains. Dawn breaks over the archaeological park as you join a team of researchers beginning excavations at what satellite imagery suggests was once a densely populated neighborhood. The pit before you has been carefully gridded off, with students and professional archaeologists gently scraping away soil with trowels and brushes. They're searching not for gold or temple treasures, but for the humble remnants of everyday life, pottery shards, food remains, and structural evidence that can help reconstruct how ordinary people lived in what was once the world's largest pre-industrial city. You carefully step down into the excavation, where a researcher points out a layer of burned material evidence of cooking fires that once warmed evening meals for a family who lived here perhaps 800 years ago. Nearby, fragments of Celadon pottery imported from China suggest this household enjoyed some measure of prosperity and participated in the extensive trade networks that connected Angkor to distant lands. A small bronze figurine, crude compared to the masterpieces adorning major temples, shows that even modest homes contained sacred objects for family worship. The soil here speaks volumes to those who know how to listen. Archaeologists have identified traces of rice grains, fish bones, and fruit seeds that outline the typical Khmer diet, not so different from what rural Cambodians eat today. Microbiological analysis of sediments reveals evidence of parasites and bacteria that once plagued the population, telling stories of health challenges in a tropical urban environment before modern sanitation. Angkor's residents may have created architectural marvels, but they still battled the same intestinal worms that afflicted their contemporaries worldwide. History isn't always glamorous. You move to another section where post holes indicate where wooden columns once supported a substantial structure, likely a wealthy merchant's home, judging by the artifacts associated with it. Unlike European cities with their stone buildings and clear street plans, Angkor's residential areas consisted primarily of organic materials, wood, bamboo, thatch, arranged in a less rigid pattern around water features and temple complexes. When abandoned, these structures disappeared almost completely, leaving only subtle traces that require modern scientific methods to detect and interpret. A senior archaeologist explains how they've identified different social classes through variations in household remains. Elite residences featured imported luxury goods, more substantial foundations and evidence of specialized diet and activities. Ordinary households show a more locally sourced material culture, though still demonstrating considerable craft specialization. At the lowest social levels, archaeological signatures become increasingly minimal, challenging researchers to reconstruct the lives of the most vulnerable population members who left the faintest traces. Historians still argue whether Angkor's social structure was as rigidly hierarchical as temple bas-reliefs suggest, with their neat rows of figures organized by rank and status. The archaeological evidence presents a more nuanced picture, with considerable variation in wealth and lifestyle that doesn't always align perfectly with the idealized social categories depicted in official art. Reality, as usual, was messier than the propaganda. You pause to examine a collection of artifacts laid out for cataloging, jewelry made from seeds and animal teeth, simple tools fashioned from bone and wood, spindle whorls used for making thread, and gaming pieces carved from clay. These humble objects connect us to universal human experiences: adornment, work, creation, play across the centuries. While tourists marvel at grand temples dedicated to gods and kings, these items speak more intimately of human lives, not so different from our own. The day grows warmer as you follow a survey team mapping subtle variations in ground elevation that indicate where ancient streets and canals once crossed this area. Using ground-penetrating radar and precision GPS, they're reconstructing the urban layout that shaped daily movement through the city. The data reveals neighborhoods organized around local temples and water sources, with main thoroughfares connecting to larger ceremonial centers. The emerging picture suggests a city that combined careful planning with organic growth, imperial vision modified by practical adaptation to landscape and community needs. A metal detector signals a find, and a technician carefully uncovers a small bronze bell, perhaps once attached to an elephant's harness or a ceremonial garment. You can almost hear its gentle tinkling, carried on a breeze through streets now silent for centuries. Sound would have been a defining aspect of Angkor's urban experience. The calls of vendors, religious chanting from temples, music from processions, and the constant background symphony of construction, as the city continuously reinvented itself through successive reigns. Near the excavation, a cluster of mango trees marks where an ancient garden once stood. Palynologists, scientists who study ancient pollen, have identified evidence of carefully cultivated spaces throughout Angkor, not just agricultural plots, but aesthetic landscapes designed for beauty and spiritual reflection. The Khmer elite surrounded themselves with carefully managed nature that mirrored cosmic order while providing practical benefits of shade, fruit, and medicinal plants. Even in the heart of this massive urban complex, green spaces moderated the tropical heat and connected residents to agricultural cycles. Taking a break from the archaeological work, you visit a workshop where researchers are recreating ancient Khmer cooking techniques. using pottery vessels similar to excavated fragments and ingredients documented in pollen and macrobotanical remains. They prepare dishes that might have been served in an Angkor household. The pungent aroma of fermented fish paste, a staple condiment, then as now in Cambodia, mingles with the smoke from a clay hearth. Food archaeology offers sensory connections to the past that artifacts alone cannot provide. You sample a rice porridge flavored with locally grown spices, a humble meal that would have sustained laborers building the massive monuments. The ingredients reflect Angkor's sophisticated agricultural system, which supported specialized food production beyond basic subsistence. Rice cultivation was particularly advanced, with archaeobotanical evidence showing multiple varieties adapted for different growing conditions. The surplus generated by this productive system freed thousands of workers for massive construction projects, while supporting specialized craftspeople who created luxury goods for elite consumption. As afternoon approaches, you join a hydrologist examining ancient water management features. Every Angkor household needed reliable water access for drinking, cooking, and sanitation, a challenge in a region with dramatic seasonal variations in rainfall. While the elite enjoyed sophisticated plumbing systems with terracotta pipes bringing water directly to their compounds, ordinary citizens relied on community wells, tanks, and carefully managed ponds. The engineering that created Angkor's famous barrays, massive reservoirs, had its household-level counterpart in these smaller, but equally essential water features. The excavation day ends with team members comparing notes on their findings. One researcher shares a thrilling discovery, distinct layers showing how a neighborhood evolved over nearly 2 centuries, with structures rebuilt, expanded, and eventually abandoned as the city's fortunes changed. This stratigraphic record allows archaeologists to track changes in material culture, economic status, and daily practices through time, revealing Angkor not as a static entity, but a dynamic urban environment constantly adapting to political, economic, and environmental pressures. As sunset approaches, you watch local farmers returning home along paths that follow ancient thoroughfares, an unconscious echo of movement patterns established centuries ago. Despite dramatic changes in technology and society, certain practical realities remain constant. People still seek efficient routes between significant locations, still gather at community water sources, still organize their living spaces according to family needs and environmental constraints. In these persistent patterns, the vanished streets of Angkor continue to influence the present landscape. Looking across fields that once contained thousands of homes, you try to imagine the city at its height, the wooden buildings with their curved roofs catching the evening light, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing in courtyards, monks walking between temples, merchants closing their stalls for the day. Archaeological evidence can reveal material culture and spatial organization, but reconstructing the sensory experience, the sounds, smells, colors, and emotions that constituted daily life requires both scientific data and informed imagination. Both are essential tools for bringing the vanished streets of Angkor back to life in our understanding. The morning rain has finally stopped as you stand on the massive earthen embankment of the Western Barre, an artificial reservoir so vast, over 7.5 kilometers long and 2.1 kilometers wide, that it's difficult to see the opposite shore through the morning mist. Created in the 11th century, this colossal engineering project required moving millions of cubic meters of earth without mechanical equipment. Modern calculations suggest it would take 10,000 workers more than 5 years to complete such a structure today, even with the advantage of modern tools. The ancient Khmer accomplished this using human labor organized on an imperial scale, creating what remains one of the largest hand-built water management features in the world. You dip your hand into the cool water, connecting physically with what archaeologist Bernard Philippe Grosselier described as Angkor's true genius, its sophisticated hydraulic engineering. While visitors marvel at carved bas-reliefs and soaring towers, the empire's most impressive achievement may have been its ability to tame the monsoon cycle, storing water during the rainy season for use during annual droughts. This mastery of water didn't just support agriculture. It became the foundation of Khmer political power and religious ideology, transforming environmental constraints into cultural advantages. Walking along the Barre's edge, you note how the structure integrates seamlessly into the broader landscape, part of a system that eventually transformed nearly 1,000 square kilometers of territory into a managed waterscape. Satellite imagery has revealed the extent of this hydraulic network: hundreds of kilometers of canals, dozens of smaller reservoirs, countless tanks and ponds, and an intricate distribution system that delivered water where and when it was needed most. The environmental manipulation was so extensive that some researchers now classify Angkor as an engineered landscape, rather than simply an urban center with surrounding territories. A fisherman poles his small boat across the reservoir, his silhouette almost timeless against the morning sky. The Barres served multiple functions beyond water storage. They provided fish for protein, created microclimate effects that moderated local temperatures, established defensive barriers, facilitated transportation, and symbolically represented the cosmic oceans of Hindu-Buddhist cosmology. This multifunctionality demonstrates how Khmer engineering blended practical concerns with spiritual significance, creating infrastructure that served both physical and metaphysical needs. You continue to a site where archaeologists have excavated part of the distribution system, a stone structure that once controlled water flow from the main reservoir into secondary canals. The engineering is surprisingly sophisticated, with adjustable gates that could regulate discharge based on seasonal needs. Analysis of silt deposits in these channels has allowed researchers to track how the system evolved over centuries, adaptations and expansions, reflecting changing climate conditions and growing population pressures. Historians still argue whether Angkor's massive hydraulic works represented genuine technological innovation, or simply the application of enormous resources to established techniques. What's certain is that the scale was unprecedented. No previous Southeast Asian civilization had attempted water management at this level. The system worked so effectively that it supported the largest concentrated population in the pre-industrial world, with recent demographic estimates suggesting Greater Angkor may have housed up to 1 million people during its peak in the 12th–13th centuries. The path leads you to a small temple situated on an artificial island in the center of the reservoir, a shrine to the water spirits that controlled this life-giving resource. Religious beliefs and hydraulic engineering were inseparable in Khmer culture, with temples often serving as both spiritual centers and key components of the water management system. Shrine orientation, drainage features, and even decorative elements reflected this dual purpose, with sacred nagas, serpent deities, doubling as water spouts, and temple moats, serving as both symbolic cosmic oceans and practical water storage. A particularly fascinating aspect of Angkor's hydraulic system was its handling of excess water, a challenge in a region where too much rainfall can be as problematic as too little. You examine what archaeologists have identified as an ancient spillway designed to prevent flooding during particularly heavy monsoons. The engineering shows remarkable foresight, with overflow channels directing excess water away from populated areas and agricultural fields. Modern hydrologists studying these features have found them surprisingly sophisticated in their understanding of flow dynamics and erosion control. As midday approaches, you reach the Eastern Mebane, a temple built on an artificial island in what was once another massive reservoir, the Eastern Baray, now dry. The structure's layout provides clues to how water levels were ritually managed, with different tiers of the temple becoming accessible as seasonal water levels fluctuated. This integration of architectural, religious, and environmental elements demonstrates how thoroughly water consciousness permeated Khmer civilization. Their monuments weren't simply placed in the landscape, but actively engaged with its hydrological cycles. Standing atop the temple platform, you survey what was once an enormous engineered body of water. Archaeological research suggests the massive barrays may have had impacts extending far beyond their immediate vicinity, potentially altering regional weather patterns through increased evaporation and humidity. Some scholars propose that this massive hydrological intervention may have created more favorable local climate conditions, essentially engineering weather as well as water distribution. If true, the ancient Khmer achieved environmental manipulation at a scale modern geoengineers would find impressive. The intense midday heat drives home another aspect of Angkor's water mastery, its role in climate mitigation. In a tropical environment where temperatures regularly exceed 95 degrees F, 35 degrees C, the distributed water features created cooling effects throughout the urban landscape. Evaporation from hundreds of ponds, moats, and reservoirs moderated ambient temperatures, while strategic water placement ensured that most residents lived within a short distance of shade-providing water features. This environmental engineering improved quality of life in ways that would have been immediately perceptible to residents, enhancing the prestige of the rulers who commissioned these works. You make your way to a small village where farmers still use sections of the ancient canal system to irrigate their rice fields. This living legacy of Angkor's water management demonstrates both the durability of the original engineering and the continued relevance of its principles. After the political collapse of the Khmer Empire, local communities maintained smaller components of the system that served their immediate needs, abandoning only the largest features that required imperial-level organization to maintain. This selective preservation created a mosaic of functional and abandoned hydraulic features that archaeologists are still working to disentangle. The afternoon brings you to one of archaeology's most intriguing questions about Angkor. Did hydrological failure contribute to the empire's decline? Evidence from soil cores and canal sediments suggests that parts of the water system began malfunctioning in the late 13th and 14th centuries, with some channels showing signs of extreme flooding followed by abandonment. Climate studies using tree ring data indicate a series of severe droughts punctuated by unusually intense monsoons during this period, precisely the kind of climatic instability that would test even the most sophisticated water management system. You examine a section of canal where excavations have revealed multiple attempts at repairs and modifications, signs of a system under stress. The engineering that successfully managed water for centuries may have ultimately fallen victim to its own rigidity, unable to adapt quickly enough to changing climate conditions. As you watch farmers using simple but flexible irrigation methods in adjacent fields, you're reminded that sometimes smaller scale, adaptable systems prove more resilient than massive, centralized infrastructure when facing environmental uncertainty. As evening approaches, you stand again on the western Barry embankment, watching the sunset reflect on water that has flowed through an ancient engineering system that still functions after a millennium. The true legacy of Angkor's water masters lies not just in the impressive scale of their works, but in the fundamental concept that human societies can creatively adapt to environmental challenges through innovative infrastructure. In an era facing unprecedented water management challenges due to climate change, these ancient engineers still have lessons to teach about resilience, adaptation, and the profound relationship between water and civilization. The early morning mist hangs between trees as you follow a narrow trail away from the well-trodden tourist routes. Your destination isn't on most visitor maps, a small, crumbling shrine half reclaimed by strangler figs and largely overlooked by restoration efforts. While millions photograph Angkor Wat and Ta Prohm each year, hundreds of smaller structures remain in various states of collapse throughout the archaeological park and beyond, their stories untold and their secrets largely unexplored. These are the shadows between temples, the lesser-known sites that collectively tell a more complete story of Khmer civilization than the famous monuments alone ever could. You push aside vines to reveal a weathered lintel carved with dancing figures, their details softened by centuries of monsoon rains, but still recognizable as celestial apsaras, similar to those adorning more famous temples. This small shrine likely served a local community, perhaps dedicated to a regional deity or ancestor spirit important to people who lived in this specific area. While grand imperial temples projected royal power and cosmic order, these neighborhood shrines reveal the diversity of religious practice that existed alongside official state cults. A gecko scurries across the carved stone, disappearing into a crack that's widened over centuries. Unlike the meticulously restored main temples, this structure reveals archaeology in its more natural state, a puzzle of collapsed elements where original architectural relationships remain visible. Studying the pattern of fallen blocks, you can determine how the roof structure failed first, followed by progressive collapse of supporting walls as earth tremors and tree roots destabilized the foundation. Each crumbled temple tells a story not just in its carvings, but in the very manner of its decay. You check your GPS coordinates against a research database, confirming this is one of dozens of similar structures identified during a comprehensive survey in the 1990s, but never fully documented. Limited resources for conservation mean difficult choices. Each site that receives funding for preservation represents dozens more that must be left to the elements. Archaeological triage becomes a painful necessity, with decisions based on historical significance, physical condition, accessibility, and sometimes simply which structures are most likely to generate tourism revenue to fund further preservation. The path continues past an unexcavated mound that satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar suggest contains another temple complex. Without digging, archaeologists can now identify buried structures through subtle differences in vegetation growth, soil moisture retention, and ground temperature. These non-invasive techniques have revolutionized Angkor archaeology, allowing researchers to document sites without disturbing them, preservation through documentation rather than excavation. Historians still argue whether these smaller, peripheral temples were constructed through local initiative or represented planned imperial expansion. The architectural evidence suggests both processes occurred simultaneously. Some show clear stylistic connections to major imperial building projects, while others incorporate regional variations that indicate more localized patronage and construction. The neat historical narratives, based solely on the grand temples, miss this complexity, imposing artificial uniformity on what was actually a diverse architectural landscape. You reach a small clearing where a team of archaeologists from the Apsara Authority, the Cambodian agency responsible for Angkor's management, carefully documents a recently discovered structure. Their methodical work, photographing each stone, assigning reference numbers, creating detailed drawings, represents a new approach to Angkor's lesser sites. Rather than focusing restoration efforts exclusively on major monuments, contemporary preservation strategy emphasizes comprehensive documentation of all remaining structures, creating a digital record that will survive even if the physical sites continue to deteriorate. The team leader explains their current project, a systematic survey of hospital chapels commissioned by King Jayavarman VII in the late 12th century. Historical inscriptions claim he built 102 such facilities throughout the empire, but identifying these structures has proven challenging. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle of how healthcare functioned in ancient Khmer society. Archaeological evidence suggests these weren't hospitals in the modern sense, but combined religious healing practices with what we might recognize as primitive pharmacology, using medicinal plants documented in inscriptions and depicted in temple carvings. A stone carving shows patients receiving treatment, one of the rare depictions of ordinary medical care from ancient Southeast Asia. Unlike the grand narrative reliefs showing mythological battles and royal processions, these smaller temples sometimes preserve scenes from everyday life that provide invaluable ethnographic information about non-elite experiences. Similar carvings at other sites depict childbirth, food preparation, market activities, and agricultural practices, glimpses of ordinary existence otherwise lost to history. As midday approaches, you visit another category of overlooked structure, the remnants of what archaeologists have identified as a rest house along an ancient royal road. These dharmasalas appear at regular intervals along major Khmer highways, providing standardized amenities for travelers in a system remarkably similar to modern rest stops. Inscriptions indicate they offered water, shade, and basic security for merchants, pilgrims, and government messengers traversing the empire. Their distribution has helped researchers reconstruct the complete Khmer road network, revealing connections between temple complexes that weren't previously recognized. You pause to examine fragments of ceramic roof tiles scattered across the forest floor, evidence of structures that have completely disappeared, except for these durable components. Unlike stone temples built for eternity, most Khmer buildings were constructed from perishable materials that left minimal archaeological signatures. These invisible structures, the residential quarters, marketplaces, performance venues, and administrative buildings that constituted the majority of Angkor's urban fabric, exist now primarily as anomalies in soil composition and subtle topographical features detectable only through specialized survey techniques. The afternoon finds you at a site that defies easy categorization. A small stone platform with carved pedestals, but no remaining statuary, located far from any identified temple complex. Such anomalous features remind archaeologists of how much remains unknown about Angkor despite decades of intensive research. This might have been a boundary marker, a rural shrine, a cremation platform, or something not yet conceived in current understanding of Khmer practices. Each such puzzle piece challenges existing interpretations and potentially opens new avenues of investigation. You join a survey team using drones to document a previously unmapped area beyond the main archaeological park boundaries. Their work reveals how inadequate the traditional concept of Angkor has been. The urban complex extended far beyond the arbitrary boundaries established during the French colonial period, with significant structures and infrastructure features continuing for kilometers in all directions. Contemporary research increasingly treats Greater Angkor as an integrated regional system rather than a discrete archaeological site with clear boundaries. The drone footage captures what appears to be a small temple mound near a modern village, potentially a new discovery not documented in existing archaeological inventories. Such finds remain surprisingly common despite over a century of systematic research. Each field season adds previously unknown structures to the archaeological record, suggesting that current maps, though far more comprehensive than early French surveys, still represent an incomplete picture of Angkor's true extent and complexity. As evening approaches, you visit one final category of overlooked structure, sites deliberately excluded from tourist itineraries due to their fragile condition or remote location. Conservation authorities face difficult balancing acts between providing access to significant monuments and protecting vulnerable sites from visitation impacts. Some of the most pristine carvings and architectural elements survive precisely because they remain off the beaten path, protected by their obscurity from both looters and loving touches of thousands of tourist hands. The shadows lengthen between temples as day transitions to night. In these less traveled spaces between famous monuments, archaeology continues to reveal new dimensions of Khmer civilization, not just grand imperial projects, but the full spectrum of religious, administrative, and community structures that supported daily life throughout the empire. The shadows between temples aren't empty spaces, but rich archaeological landscapes waiting to be understood. Each modest shrine and crumbling wall adding nuance to our understanding of one of history's most remarkable civilizations. Dawn breaks over the research facility, where you've been invited to observe a team of archaeological technicians processing the previous day's field data. Computer screens glow with false color satellite images, LiDAR elevation models, and ground-penetrating radar scans. You're watching the modern technological revolution that has completely transformed our understanding of Cambodia's lost cities in just the past 2 decades. This is where we found what looks like a buried road network, explains the head technician, pointing to subtle linear features on the screen that your untrained eye would have missed completely. The ghost of a thoroughfare stretches for kilometers through what today appears to be unbroken jungle canopy. 10 years ago, we would have needed 100 workers with machetes to even suspect this existed. You're witnessing archaeology's great leap forward. For centuries, exploring these sites meant hacking through dense vegetation with limited sight lines, never seeing the forest for the trees, quite literally. Explorers like Henry Mauhat, whom you'll remember stumbled upon Angkor Wat in the 1860s, could only describe what stood right in front of them. Even after clearing spaces around individual temples, no one could grasp the full extent of what lay hidden beneath the jungle floor. The technician clicks to another image. This thermal scan from last night shows cooling patterns consistent with buried stone architecture. The stones retain heat differently than the surrounding soil. The technology reveals ghostly rectangular outlines of structures buried for centuries, invisible to the naked eye, but clearly present once you know how to look. Modern archaeological investigation of Cambodia's hidden cities relies on a multi-layered approach that would seem like witchcraft to those early explorers. Remote sensing technologies now allow archaeologists to peer through the jungle canopy beneath the ground and across vast landscapes without disturbing a single leaf. It's as though we finally developed a pair of special glasses that let us see what's been there all along. One of the most revelatory technologies has been satellite imagery. Beginning in the 1990s, researchers started examining space-based photographs of the region surrounding Angkor. Even basic aerial perspectives revealed subtle topographical features, moats, reservoirs, and canal systems, extending far beyond the known temple complexes. Historians still argue whether these early satellite findings represented the first true understanding of Angkor as not just a collection of temples, but an enormous urban complex spanning nearly 3,000 square kilometers. The real game changer was when we started using multispectral imaging, continues the technician, showing you a rainbow-colored map where different wavelengths of light reveal features invisible to the human eye. Healthy vegetation reflects near-infrared light differently than stressed plants. And as it happens, plants growing above buried structures often show subtle signs of stress due to shallower soil and altered drainage patterns. You lean in closer as she points to a slight discoloration following a perfect geometric pattern. That's a temple platform we haven't excavated yet. The difference in vegetation health is so subtle that you'd walk right over it and never notice. But from space, with the right sensors, it might as well be marked with neon signs. Beyond satellite imagery, aircraft-mounted sensors have proven invaluable. You might be surprised to learn that some of the most important archaeological discoveries in Cambodia originated from declassified military intelligence. During the Vietnam War, American reconnaissance planes photographed large swathes of Cambodia, capturing images that decades later would help archaeologists identify previously unknown temple sites and infrastructure networks. And here's my personal favorite, says the technician, pulling up what looks like a black and white X-ray of the landscape. Ground-penetrating radar. We can actually see buried foundations without digging. The technology works by sending radar pulses into the ground and measuring how they bounce back, creating images of subsurface anomalies like walls, floors, and artifacts hidden beneath centuries of accumulated soil and vegetation. The most amusing part of all this technological wizardry. Sometimes the most significant discoveries come from the most unexpected places. In 2015, an Australian filmmaker flying a consumer-grade drone over the jungle near Angkor captured footage of perfectly square moats and mounds that turned out to be previously undocumented temple sites. Not exactly cutting-edge archaeological equipment, but it got the job done. Imagine explaining to Henry Mauhat that one day we discover ancient temples using flying robot cameras you can buy at the local mall for a few $100s. What's particularly fascinating is how these technologies complement, rather than replace, traditional archaeological methods. The sensor data might tell you where to look, but someone still needs to grab a trowel and carefully excavate to confirm what's actually there. It's a perfect marriage of high-tech scanning and old-school dirt archaeology. As you follow the technician through the facility, she shows you 3D reconstructions of temples built from thousands of digital photographs. Photogrammetry lets us create perfect digital models of these structures, she explains. We can preserve them digitally, even as the physical sites deteriorate. These models are so precise that researchers can study architectural details and even identify tool marks made by ancient stonemasons over 1,000 years ago. But perhaps the most profound shift in archaeology isn't just about finding things. It's about understanding contexts and connections. By mapping vast areas rather than isolated monuments, researchers have fundamentally changed how we view these ancient Cambodian civilizations. What once seemed like scattered temple ruins lost in the jungle now appears as an intentionally designed landscape of urban centers, water management systems, and agricultural networks spanning hundreds of square kilometers. The technician smiles as she pulls up one final image. This is what we're working on today. It's a composite map showing not just Angkor, but several other massive urban complexes across Cambodia, all interconnected by roads and canals. We're not just finding lost cities anymore, she says. We're rediscovering an entire lost world. If you thought the technological advances we just explored were impressive, you might want to hold onto your pith helmet for this next revelation. In 2012, a technology called LiDAR light detection and ranging completely upended our understanding of Cambodia's ancient cities almost overnight. It was archaeology's equivalent of putting on Superman's X-ray vision goggles. You're now sitting in a helicopter, hovering above the jungle canopy, watching as a technician monitors a strange apparatus mounted beneath the aircraft. The device is firing hundreds of thousands of laser pulses per second toward the ground below. Each pulse bounces off whatever it hits: leaves, branches, ground, or ancient stonework, and returns to the sensor. By measuring how long each pulse takes to return, the system creates an incredibly detailed 3D map of everything beneath the helicopter. Here's the truly magical part. Unlike conventional aerial photography, which can only capture what's visible from above, LiDAR effectively strips away the jungle canopy in the resulting data. Special software separates the laser returns into different categories: those that bounced off treetops, those that managed to slip through gaps in the leaves and hit mid-story vegetation, and crucially, the precious few that reached all the way to the ground. About 1 in 10 pulses makes it to the forest floor, explains the technician, who's barely containing her excitement as data streams across her laptop. But that's enough. We're collecting billions of data points across this survey area. When processed, these ground returns create what archaeologists rather poetically call a bare earth model, a detailed topographical map showing the contours of the land, as if the jungle had been completely removed. Suddenly, artificial mounds, moats, reservoirs, roads, and the foundations of thousands of structures previously hidden beneath dense vegetation become clearly visible. The first major LiDAR survey of Angkor in 2012 was something of a scientific bombshell. In just 2 weeks of flights, covering about 370 square kilometers, researchers mapped tens of thousands of previously unknown features. The resulting data revealed that the landscape between the already known temples was far from empty jungle. It was filled with evidence of dense urban settlements, sophisticated hydraulic engineering, and extensive agricultural systems. "Look at this," says the technician, showing you a processed LiDAR image on her screen. What appeared to be natural undulations in the jungle floor from ground level are unmistakably artificial in the bare earth model, perfectly straight lines forming a grid of what were once streets, house platforms, and ponds. Those archaeologists who spent years hacking through the undergrowth with machetes, they were literally walking right over these features every day without realizing they were there. The results were so dramatic that some senior archaeologists initially refused to believe them, suspecting some kind of data processing error. How could features this extensive have remained undetected for so long? But the evidence was irrefutable, and subsequent ground verification confirmed what the lasers had found. LiDAR revealed that Angkor wasn't just large, it was massive, the largest pre-industrial urban complex in the world, covering an area similar to modern-day Los Angeles. More importantly, it showed that the spaces between the grand temples, previously thought to be largely uninhabited, were actually densely populated urban areas with complex infrastructure. But the revolution didn't stop at Angkor. In 2015, archaeologists conducted a LiDAR survey of Phnom Kulen, a forested plateau about 30 kilometers northeast of Angkor. What they found was astonishing: an entire city that historians had missed entirely. Named Mahendraparvata, this 1,200-year-old urban center predated Angkor and likely served as an early capital of the Khmer Empire. Despite being just a short distance from one of the most intensively studied archaeological sites in Southeast Asia, this entire city had remained hidden beneath the trees until LDAR revealed its existence. The thing about jungle archaeology, the technician explains as the helicopter banks toward another survey area, is that you can be standing right on top of an ancient road or temple platform and have absolutely no idea it's there. The vegetation is so thick that you can't see more than a few meters in any direction. You can't perceive the subtle elevation changes that might indicate artificial structures. LDAR gives us that perspective. In 2019, an even larger LDAR campaign mapped more than 1,600 square kilometers across Cambodia. The results were, if anything, even more spectacular than the initial surveys. Multiple previously unknown urban centers were identified, some rivaling Angkor in sophistication, if not in scale. The data revealed vast networks of highways connecting these cities, raised earthen causeways, some up to 40 meters wide, radiating across the landscape like spokes from a wheel. One particularly amusing anecdote comes from researchers who had spent decades studying a specific temple complex. After seeing the LDAR data, they realized they had been parking their cars every day on what was actually a 900-year-old elevated highway leading to the temple. They'd assumed it was just a convenient natural ridge. In reality, they'd been driving on an ancient Khmer expressway built a millennium ago. The most significant revelation from these LDAR surveys wasn't just the discovery of individual features, but the recognition of how extensively the Khmer had engineered their environment. Nearly every square meter of land had been modified for water management, agriculture, or urban development. What Western explorers had romantically described as temples being reclaimed by jungle was actually a sophisticated urban landscape that had been deliberately constructed, then abandoned, and finally obscured by centuries of forest growth. Historians still argue whether these LDAR findings represent the final chapter in understanding Cambodia's hidden cities, or merely the beginning of a new era of discovery. Some suggest that we've only scratched the surface, that further surveys will reveal even more extensive urban networks stretching across Southeast Asia. As the helicopter turns back toward base, the technician shows you one final image, a composite LDAR map showing vast interconnected urban complexes spanning hundreds of kilometers. 10 years ago, we thought we knew what was out there, she says. Now, it's like we've discovered a whole new civilization hiding in plain sight. The real irony of all this high-tech discovery, much of this knowledge wasn't actually lost to everyone. Local communities living near these temples often maintained oral histories about the extent of the ancient cities. Cambodian villagers would frequently tell archaeologists about features in the landscape that indicated ancient occupation, subtle clues that scientific surveys have now confirmed. In many LDAR hasn't so much discovered new knowledge as it has validated what local traditions had preserved all along. As you disembark from the helicopter, you can't help but wonder what other ancient wonders might still be hiding under forest canopies around the world, waiting for the right technology to reveal them. And how many more discoveries will turn out to be knowledge that local populations have carried with them all along. You're now standing at the edge of a small village near Angkor, watching as an archaeological team overlays their digital maps onto the physical landscape. Armed with GPS units and tablet computers displaying the LDAR data we explored earlier, they're systematically ground-truthing the findings, confirming that the ghostly outlines revealed by lasers actually correspond to physical structures buried beneath the jungle floor. "See this slight rise?" asks the lead archaeologist, pointing to what looks like an unremarkable bump in the forest floor. On her tablet, the same spot shows up as a perfect rectangle, the foundation of what was once a substantial wooden building. This entire area was a densely populated neighborhood. She sweeps her arm across what now appears to be untamed jungle. Based on our estimates, there were over 500,000 people living in Greater Angkor at its peak. The scale of what's been revealed is almost impossible to comprehend. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists focused primarily on the grand temple complexes of Angkor, the massive stone structures like Angkor Wat and Bayon that had survived the centuries. The spaces between these monuments were largely ignored, assumed to be relatively empty. Now, we know that assumption couldn't have been more wrong. The emerging picture is of a vast, low-density urban complex spread across roughly 3,000 square kilometers, an area larger than modern New York City. Unlike the concentrated urban centers of contemporary European cities, the Khmer capital followed what archaeologists call an extended urban model. Neighborhoods, temples, and administrative buildings interspersed with productive agricultural land, reservoirs, and forests. It wasn't just Angkor either, continues the archaeologist as you follow her deeper into the forest. What we're discovering is that similar urban complexes existed across Cambodia. She shows you a regional map where multiple massive settlement complexes are highlighted: Ko Ker, Phnom Kulen, Prekon of Kampong Sve, Banti Chhmar, and many others. These weren't isolated cities. They were connected by an extensive network of highways and canals that facilitated trade, administrative control, and military movements across the empire. The highways themselves are engineering marvels that had largely escaped detection until recently. Raised several meters above the surrounding floodplains, these roadways, some up to 35 meters wide, radiated outward from Angkor like spokes from the hub of a wheel, connecting it to regional centers and distant provinces. The longest identified so far stretches over 60 kilometers, perfectly straight across challenging terrain. You crouch down to examine what the archaeologist identifies as one such roadway, now reduced to a subtle rise in the forest floor. If you were standing here 1,000 years ago, she explains, you'd be watching imperial messengers trade caravans, and military units passing by on their way to the farthest reaches of the empire. The road and canal network, revealed by recent surveys, suggests a level of imperial integration far beyond what historians previously imagined. The Khmer Empire at its height controlled a territory spanning much of mainland Southeast Asia, from the borders of Myanmar to southern Vietnam. Maintaining control over such a vast region required sophisticated communication and transportation networks, precisely what these newly discovered highways provided. What's particularly fascinating is how these findings have forced archaeologists to reconsider the very nature of urbanism in ancient Southeast Asia. Western conceptions of cities traditionally involve dense clusters of buildings surrounded by city walls, clearly delineated from the surrounding countryside. The Khmer urban model was fundamentally different, more like a galaxy of settlement clusters spread across an extensively managed landscape, with agricultural production integrated into the urban fabric. We used to debate whether Angkor should be considered a city at all. The archaeologist tells you as you pause beside a small temple that doesn't appear on any tourist map. Now we understand it was a city, just not the kind Europeans would recognize. The entire landscape was urbanized in its way. The transportation networks extended beyond roads to include hundreds of kilometers of canals. These waterways served multiple purposes: moving people and goods, providing irrigation for agriculture, and connecting the elaborate water management systems that sustained the population through seasonal droughts and monsoons. One of the quirkier discoveries from the recent mapping projects involves the identification of what archaeologists have dubbed tank roads, hybrid structures that functioned as both raised highways during the wet season and as water storage features during the dry months. Talk about efficient design. Imagine if Interstate 95 could also serve as a reservoir when needed. The ancient Khmer were masters of multifunctional landscape engineering, making every modification serve multiple purposes. As you continue your walk, the archaeologist leads you to a clearing where a team is carefully excavating what appears to be a house mound, a slightly elevated platform where a wooden residence once stood. Based on the LIDAR data, we've identified tens of thousands of these residential platforms across the greater Angkor region, she explains. Most houses were built of organic materials, wood, thatch, bamboo, that decomposed long ago. But the platforms they stood on remain as subtle elevations in the landscape. The distribution of these house mounds reveals distinct neighborhoods and settlement patterns. Some clusters are oriented around small local temples, others along roads or canals, and still others appear to be organized according to occupational specialties. Historians still argue whether these patterns reflect deliberate urban planning or more organic development over centuries of growth. Perhaps the most mind-boggling aspect of these discoveries is their implications for understanding Khmer population density. Previous estimates for Angkor's population typically ranged from 80,000 to 150,000 people, new data suggests the greater Angkor region may have supported 700,000 to 1 million inhabitants at its peak in the 12th and 13th centuries, making it one of the largest pre-industrial urban complexes in the world. The scale of infrastructure required to support this population was immense, says the archaeologist, showing you a map of the water management system. The entire landscape was engineered to capture, store, and distribute water. The system included massive reservoirs called barrays, the largest covering almost 16 square kilometers, thousands of smaller ponds, canals, dikes, and spillways, all working together to harness the seasonal monsoon rains and maintain water supplies throughout the year. What's becoming increasingly clear is that these weren't just isolated, lost cities waiting to be discovered, but components of an integrated regional system, a metropolitan network spanning much of what is now Cambodia. The connections between these urban centers were physical, roads and canals, administrative imperial control, religious Buddhism and Hinduism, and economic trade networks and resource extraction. As you near the end of your walk, the archaeologist points to her tablet one last time. "This is what we're working on identifying now," she says, indicating faint linear patterns stretching toward the horizon. "We think these might be the outlines of ancient field systems, bunded rice paddies that fed the population. The agricultural landscapes that supported these massive urban complexes were just as extensively engineered as the cities themselves, with complex irrigation systems maximizing production. You realize that what you're seeing is the archaeological equivalent of peeling an onion layers upon layers of human modification, each revealing more about how this ancient civilization functioned. What was once characterized as a series of temple ruins scattered through virgin jungle is now understood as one of the most extensively engineered landscapes in pre-industrial history. The sun is setting as you make your way back to the village, casting long shadows across what you now recognize as an ancient urban landscape disguised as natural forest. You'll never look at this jungle the same way again. Dawn finds you sitting, cross-legged on a wooden platform, beside an elderly Cambodian man who introduces himself as Ta Chauk. You're in a small village that sits literally atop the ruins of what was once a thriving neighborhood of Greater Angkor. The modern houses, built on stilts to avoid seasonal flooding, stand above the same landscape that supported their ancestors a millennium ago. My grandfather told me stories about the spirits who built the temples, Ta Chauk says, gesturing toward a small, partially ruined shrine barely visible through the trees. When I was a boy, this shrine was our secret place. The French archaeologists never found it. We kept it clean and left offerings. He smiles, revealing teeth stained red from betel nut. Now it's on all the maps and has a number. Progress, I suppose. What you're witnessing is the complex relationship between Cambodia's ancient past and its living present. While Western narratives often portrayed these cities as lost or abandoned to the jungle, local communities maintained connections to these places through religious practices, oral histories, and daily life. They weren't so much lost as overlooked by outsiders who didn't know how to see them. Ta Ch Hauk leads you along a narrow path toward the shrine, pointing out features in the landscape that would be invisible to untrained eyes. See how the ground rises slightly here, and how the bamboo grows differently. Ancient road, he states matter-of-factly. His knowledge, passed down through generations, aligns perfectly with what LIDAR and ground-penetrating radar have recently discovered. This pattern repeats across Cambodia, scientific discoveries, often confirming what local knowledge has preserved all along. When archaeologists first revealed the massive urban complex of Mahendra Parvata on Phnom Kulen using LIDAR in 2015, they were shocked by its scale and sophistication. Yet local villagers had names for many of the places identified, had found pottery and other artifacts while farming, and maintained small shrines at several of the temple sites. The city wasn't lost to them, just to the archaeological record. My family has lived here for 7 generations, Ta Ch Hauk tells you as you reach the small shrine. When the Khmer Rouge came, we had to leave for 4 years. Many people died. When we returned, the forest had already started reclaiming our fields. His story highlights another aspect of Cambodia's lost cities. Their modern rediscovery is inextricably linked to the country's recent traumatic history. Between 1975 and 1979, the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime forcibly evacuated cities, abolished private property, and reorganized the entire population into agricultural collectives. Nearly 2 million Cambodians, about a quarter of the population, died from execution, starvation, or disease. The disruption to rural communities fractured traditional knowledge systems and accelerated the forest's encroachment on archaeological sites as fields were abandoned. The aftermath of this tragedy coincided with renewed international interest in Cambodia's archaeological heritage. As the country gradually stabilized in the 1990s, conservation efforts intensified, particularly around Angkor, which was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1992. You're now following Ta Ch Hauk into a community meeting hall where a group of local residents are gathered with representatives from an archaeological project. They're discussing plans for documenting oral histories related to nearby temple sites. This collaboration between scientific researchers and local knowledge holders represents a significant evolution in how Cambodia's ancient past is studied and preserved. For too long, archaeology here was something foreigners did, explains the project leader, a Cambodian archaeologist trained at the Royal University of Fine Arts in Phnom Penh. They would come, excavate, publish in foreign journals, and leave. Now we're building capacity for Cambodians to lead research and conservation efforts, integrating scientific methods with traditional knowledge. This shift reflects broader changes in archaeological practice worldwide, but it holds special significance in Cambodia, where colonial legacies loom large. When French explorers and archaeologists began documenting Angkor in the late 19th century, their work was inseparable from France's colonial project in Indochina. The narrative they constructed of discovering lost cities that had been abandoned to the jungle conveniently overlooked the fact that Cambodians had maintained connections to these sites all along. Today's approach emphasizes partnership rather than extraction. At Banti Chhmar, a massive temple complex in northwestern Cambodia, local community members serve as site guardians and guides, sharing their knowledge with visitors and researchers alike. Similar initiatives exist at dozens of sites across the country, creating sustainable livelihoods while preserving heritage. The old people remember things the machines can't find, Ta Chhauk tells you as you observe the meeting. My grandmother used to talk about an ancient road that connected our village to the royal palace. The archaeologists searched for years, but couldn't find it. Then last year, their LiDAR machine showed it was exactly where she always said. Beyond oral histories, local communities often maintain spiritual connections to archaeological sites through ongoing religious practices. Many ancient temples have been continuously used as Buddhist shrines, with modern monks and lay practitioners caring for the sites and maintaining their sacred status. At some remote temples, you might find fresh flowers or incense left as offerings, evidence that these places remain spiritually alive despite their apparent abandonment. This continuous religious engagement creates both challenges and opportunities for conservation. On one hand, active use can sometimes accelerate physical deterioration of fragile structures. On the other, it ensures these places remain meaningful parts of living culture rather than mere tourist attractions. The intersection of tourism, heritage conservation, and local livelihoods creates complex dynamics around Cambodia's archaeological sites. Angkor alone receives over 2 million international visitors annually pre-pandemic, generating crucial revenue for one of Southeast Asia's poorest countries. Yet mass tourism brings its own threats to both tangible heritage, physical damage to monuments, and intangible heritage, commercialization of cultural practices. Before the tourists came in large numbers, our village was very poor, admits Ta Chhauk as you walk back toward his home. Now many families have someone working at the hotels or as drivers. My grandson is studying to be a guide. But sometimes I wonder if the tourists understand what these places truly mean to us. The most encouraging development you observe is the growing number of Cambodians taking leadership roles in researching and protecting their own heritage. The Apsaran National Authority, which manages the Angkor Archaeological Park, employs hundreds of Cambodian archaeologists, conservators, and other specialists. International teams increasingly work under Cambodian direction rather than the other way around. As afternoon approaches, Ta Chhauk invites you to join a ceremony at the small shrine you visited earlier. Community members gather to make offerings to the Neek Ta territorial spirits, believed to protect the land and its inhabitants. Many of these spirit cults have origins dating back to pre-Angkorian times, representing another thread of continuity between past and present. The ritual unfolds with the casual familiarity of a practice, embedded in daily life rather than performed for outsiders. An elderly woman arranges offerings of rice, fruit, and incense while softly chanting prayers. Children play nearby, occasionally pausing to observe before returning to their games. This isn't heritage preservation as museum curation, it's heritage as lived experience. What strikes you most powerfully is how these contemporary guardians of ancient knowledge embody resilience, cultural, spiritual, and physical. Despite centuries of forest encroachment, colonization, war, and genocide, connections to the past have endured, sometimes tenuously, but never completely broken. The temples don't belong to the past, Ta Ch Hauk tells you as the ceremony concludes. They belong to now, to us, to Cambodia. He gestures toward the surrounding landscape, which you can now see as a palimpsest, layer upon layer of human history, from ancient urban infrastructure to recent agricultural modifications, all overlapping beneath the canopy of trees. The cities were never really lost. We were here all along. As the sun begins to set, casting long shadows across what you now recognize as an ancient modern landscape, you reflect on how the story of Cambodia's lost cities is as much about present and future as it is about the past. The true guardians of this heritage aren't just archaeologists with high-tech equipment or conservation experts with advanced degrees. They're the millions of Cambodians reclaiming their history after decades of disruption, finding in these ancient stones foundations for cultural revival and national identity. Night has fallen as you make your way along a narrow path, illuminated only by your guide's flashlight. You're headed to a small temple on the outskirts of the Angkor Archaeological Park, one that doesn't appear in most guidebooks. The structure emerges from the darkness, a modest tower standing alone in a small clearing, its stone face etched with centuries of weather and adorned with moss. "This is where I come to think," says your guide, a young Cambodian archaeologist who's been showing you around for the past 2 weeks. She sets down her backpack and produces a small battery-powered lantern that casts a warm glow across the ancient sandstone. Away from the tourist crowds, you can almost hear the past speaking. As you sit in contemplative silence beside this 1,000-year-old structure, you reflect on everything you've learned about Cambodia's hidden cities. The story that's emerged isn't just about lost architecture rediscovered, it's about reimagining an entire civilization and its relationship to the landscape. It's about how knowledge gets preserved, lost, and reconstructed. And it's about how the past continues to shape the present in ways both obvious and subtle. The civilization that built Angkor and its contemporaries represents one of humanity's most ambitious attempts to engineer an entire landscape. At its height, the Khmer Empire transformed thousands of square kilometers of terrain into a complex urban system supporting perhaps 1 million people. They built the largest religious monument in the world, Angkor Wat, developed water management systems that sustained their population through seasonal extremes, and created a road network connecting distant provinces into a cohesive imperial system. And then, for reasons still debated by scholars, this massive urban system underwent a profound transformation. Beginning in the 14th century, the administrative center shifted south toward Phnom Penh. The massive hydraulic infrastructure that had sustained Greater Angkor gradually fell into disrepair. Population dispersed. Forest reclaimed urban spaces. What had been one of the world's largest cities fragmented into scattered villages amid temple ruins. Yet even as the giant urban system disintegrated, knowledge of these places never completely vanished. Local communities maintained connections through religious practice and oral tradition. The temples weren't forgotten. They were repurposed, reinterpreted, and integrated into new cultural frameworks, as Buddhism largely replaced the Hindu and Mahayana Buddhist traditions that had inspired their construction. What you've witnessed throughout this journey is not so much the discovery of something truly lost as the reconnection of different knowledge systems, local memory with global archaeology, indigenous understanding with scientific method, spiritual significance with historical documentation. Your guide points to barely visible carvings on the temple wall, dancing apsaras similar to those you've seen at Angkor Wat, but weathered almost beyond recognition. When I was a child, she says, my grandmother used to tell me these dancers came alive at night to perform for the gods. I believed her completely. She smiles at the memory. Now I'm an archaeologist with a PhD, but sometimes, in places like this at night, I still wonder if she might have been right. This interweaving of the magical and the mundane, the scientific and the spiritual, characterizes much of Cambodia's relationship with its archaeological heritage. The temples are simultaneously tourist attractions, active religious sites, symbols of national identity, subjects of scientific research, and sources of economic opportunity. They exist in multiple dimensions at once. As Cambodia continues its recovery from decades of conflict and cultural disruption, these ancient sites have taken on new significance. They serve as anchors of continuity, tangible connections to a time when Khmer civilization led the region in power, artistic achievement, and technological innovation. For a nation rebuilding after near destruction under the Khmer Rouge, this heritage provides both cultural foundation and future aspiration. The technological advances that have revolutionized our understanding of these sites, LiDAR, satellite imagery, digital modeling, continue to evolve. Just as Henry Mauhat's discovery of Angkor in the 1860s represented only the beginning of Western engagement with these monuments, the revelations of the past decade likely represent just the opening chapter of a new era of understanding. What might future technologies reveal? Perhaps ground-penetrating technologies will map every structure buried beneath the forest floor. Perhaps advanced analysis of sediment cores will provide year-by-year chronicles of environmental change and human adaptation. Perhaps techniques not yet invented will answer questions we haven't even thought to ask. Yet, as your journey has shown, technology alone can never tell the full story. the intimate knowledge of local communities, the spiritual significance maintained through centuries of practice, the cultural memories preserved in ritual and story. These are equally valuable windows into the past. The most complete understanding emerges from bringing these different ways of knowing into conversation with each other. Your guide extinguishes her lantern, leaving you both in darkness beneath the stars. "Listen," she whispers. "The night is alive with sound, cicadas buzzing, frogs calling, the distant hoot of an owl. This acoustic landscape differs little from what the original builders of this temple would have heard a millennium ago." For a moment, time seems to fold in on itself. You can almost sense the countless generations who have stood in this same spot, the original architects and stonemasons, the pilgrims and priests who maintained it through the centuries, the villagers who protected it during troubled times, the archaeologists who documented it, and now you, a temporary visitor in this ancient place. The hidden cities of Cambodia whisper an important truth. Nothing created by humans truly disappears. It may transform, fragment, be forgotten, and remembered again, but traces always remain in the land, in memory, in culture. The massive urban complexes you've explored weren't erased by the jungle. They were incorporated into it, becoming part of new ecological and cultural systems. As you prepare to leave this quiet temple and return to the modern world of airplanes and internet connections, you carry with you a deeper understanding not just of Cambodia's ancient cities, but of how the past lives on in the present. The story of these places isn't finished. It continues to unfold through ongoing research, conservation efforts, and the daily lives of those who call this land home. The temples and cities may have been hidden for centuries, but they were never truly lost. They were waiting patiently beneath the green canopy, whispering their secrets to anyone who learned how to listen. Your guide lights her flashlight to lead you back along the path. "Come," she says, "I'll show you the way home."